The dual suns of Aurora's Rest had long since dipped below the jagged rim of the canyon, leaving Hearthdeep Valley bathed in the spectral, bioluminescent glow of the forest that clung to the upper cliffs. Down here, in the bowl of the valley, the light was softer, a mixture of lantern fire and the faint, rhythmic pulse emanating from the earth itself. It was a peaceful place, or at least it pretended to be. Stephen wiped the sawdust from his hands onto his heavy canvas apron. The smell of shaved cedar and pine filled the small workshop attached to the front of his home. His house, like most in Hearthdeep, was half-built and half-carved directly into the sandstone wall of the valley. It was sturdy, unpretentious, and enduring, much like Stephen himself. He was a man composed of sharp angles and rough textures, his face weathered by years of sun, and worry, his eyes the color of tempered steel. He was known simply as the Vet to the 300 or so souls who called this valley home. They said it with a mixture of respect and distance, the way one might look at a dormant volcano. They knew he fixed their fences, built their furniture, and mended their plows. They did not know, and he did not say what he used to break before he started fixing things. Stephen hung his apron on a hook and stepped into the main living space. The air inside was warm, heated by the central stone hearth. "Iris," he called out softly. "In bed, Papa," a small voice chirped from the alcove. Stephen smiled, the expression softening the hard lines around his mouth. He walked to the sleeping alcove. 7-year-old Iris was a bundle of energy, wrapped in a quilt, her dark hair a halo against the pillow. She looked nothing like him and everything like her mother. Teeth brushed. Yes. Face washed. Yes. Nightmares checked for, Iris giggled. "You have to check." Stephen sat on the edge of the mattress. He made a show of looking under the bed, then inspecting the ceiling, and finally tapping the wall. "Perimeter secure. No monsters allowed. Building code violation." Iris laughed, a sound like wind chimes. Stephen leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Good night, Bug." "Good night, Papa." He watched her eyes close, waiting until her breathing evened out into the rhythm of sleep. Then he stood up and turned to his own bed, which sat on the opposite side of the room. It was a large bed, built from the red heartwood of the upper forest, sturdy enough to hold a family. Now it only held him. Stephen performed the ritual he had performed every night for 5 years. He walked to the empty side of the bed, the left side. He smoothed the quilt, pulling it taut, so there were no wrinkles. He fluffed the pillow that no one would use. He adjusted the corner of the sheet, ensuring it was inviting, as if someone were just about to slip in after brushing their hair. It was a pathetic habit, he told himself. A ghost of a gesture. But his hands moved on their own, guided by a subconscious instinct to protect a space that was no longer occupied. The empty side of the bed was not just a lack of a person. It was a physical weight, a cold gravity that pulled at him every time he looked at it. He turned away sharply, unable to stare at the smooth pillow for too long. A dull throb began at the base of his skull. Stephen gritted his teeth, pressing the heel of his hand against his temple. The floorboards beneath his boots gave a microscopic shudder. It was not an earthquake, not in the geological sense. It was a vibration, a resonance that traveled up through the bedrock, through the stone foundation, and settled directly into the metal plates in his head and the marrow of his bones. The glass root was stirring. He walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly. Most people in Hearthdeep thought the occasional tremors were just the planet settling. They admired the beauty of the glass root, the massive planetary-scale network of crystalline roots that crisscrossed beneath the surface of Aurora's Rest. They treated it like a natural wonder. Stephen knew better. He knew it the way a soldier knows the sound of a safety catch clicking off in the dark. His gaze drifted to the corner of the room behind the heavy oak wardrobe. There, tucked in the shadows, sat a metal box. It was scarred, dented, and locked with a biometric seal that had not scanned a fingerprint in half a decade. Inside lay the resonance tools, the amplifiers, the things that could sing to the glass and make it shatter or scream. He forced his eyes away. He was a carpenter now. He built chairs. He did not break worlds. Earlier that day, the unease had started. Stephen had taken his old hauler, a battery-operated cart that had seen better days, out to the western ridge to fix a collapsed barn roof for Garin, an old farmer who paid in sacks of tubers and goat cheese. The drive was usually meditative. The valley was a lush, terraced expanse of green and gold, fed by the underground aquifers. But today, the air felt thin, charged with static. When he arrived at Garin's farm, the old man was standing by the edge of his orchard, looking down at the soil with a perplexed expression. "Morning, Stephen," Garin said, scratching his bald head. "Glad you came. The roof is a mess, but look at this." Stephen stepped out of the hauler, his tool belt clinking. He walked over to where Garin pointed. At the base of a massive fruit tree, the soil had pulled back. Protruding from the dark earth were thin, translucent veins. They looked like glass, spun by a feverish spider, glowing with a faint, sickly violet pulse. They were wrapped around the tree roots, tight constricting. "Pretty, ain't it?" Garin said. "Never seen the glass root come up this high. Usually it stays deep in the bedrock." "Think it's dangerous?" Stephen felt the headache spike, a needle of warning driving into his brain. He felt the vibration in his boots, a dissonant hum, like a choir, singing slightly out of tune. "It's feeding," a voice from his past whispered. "It's not just existing. I'm hungry." "It is probably just the heavy rains we had last week," Stephen lied. The words tasted like ash. "Washed away the topsoil, exposed the upper capillaries." "You think?" Garin poked one of the glass veins with his boot. The violet light flared, pulsing brighter. "Don't touch it," Stephen snapped louder than he intended. Garin jumped back, surprised. All right. Touchy today, aren't we, vet?" Stephen exhaled, forcing his shoulders to drop. "Sorry. Glass edges can be sharp. Don't want you cutting your boots. I will get that roof fixed." He turned away, marching toward the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs. He should have told Garin to evacuate the orchard. He should have told him that when the glass root rises to the surface, it means the network below is agitated, seeking energy, preparing for a surge. But if he said that, Garin would ask how he knew. And if Garin asked, the town council would ask. And then the quiet life Stephen had built for Iris, the life of sawdust and bedtime stories, would evaporate. He fixed the roof. He took the payment. He drove home in silence, trying to ignore the violet after-images burning in his retinas. Now it was late. The moons were high, casting long silver shadows across the floor of his workshop. Stephen sat on his stool, a block of ironwood in one hand and a carving knife in the other. He was whittling a toy for Iris, a small horse to add to her collection. The wood was hard, resisting the blade, but Stephen found comfort in the resistance. It was a problem he could solve with pressure and angle, unlike the humming beneath his feet. Thud. The sound was heavy, wet. It came from the courtyard outside his front door. Stephen froze, the knife hovering over the wood. It was followed by a sound that made the hair on his arms stand up, a low, guttural moan. It wasn't the wind howling through the canyon. It wasn't the distant rumble of a rockslide. It was the sound of a living thing in pain, a sound that carried a weight of mass behind it. Stephen set the knife down. He stood up, his movements fluid and silent. He didn't reach for a weapon of war. He didn't keep those accessible. Instead, he grabbed the heavy wooden mallet he used for driving joinery pegs. He moved to the door, unlatched it, and pushed it open. The night air was crisp, biting with the chill of the high desert. Stephen stepped out onto the flagstones of his courtyard. The bioluminescence from the forest above cast strange, shifting patterns on the ground. At first, he thought a boulder had fallen from the cliffs. A massive golden shape lay sprawled across his herb garden, crushing the rosemary and sage. Then the boulder breathed. Stephen tightened his grip on the mallet, stepping closer. It was a fox. But calling it a fox was like calling a mountain a hill. The creature was immense, easily the size of a draft horse. Its fur was a radiant, shimmering gold, even in the moonlight thick and lustrous. It had 9 tails. No, Stephen counted quickly. One massive tail that seemed to fracture into phantom afterimages when it moved. The creature was lying on its side, panting. A dark, viscous liquid matted the fur on its flank. It let out another moan, a sound that vibrated in Stephen's chest. Its eyes opened. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were emerald green, slit-pupilled, but filled with a shocking, terrifying intelligence. They locked onto Stephen, lucid and assessing even through the haze of pain. Stephen lowered the mallet. The soldier in him screamed that this was a predator, a dominant species from the upper forest, a threat. But the father in him saw the blood, the shallow breathing, the desperation. "You are a long way from the canopy," Stephen murmured. The giant fox tried to rise its claws, scraping against the stone, sparking. It collapsed back down, a whimper escaping its throat. Stephen looked around. The valley was asleep. If he left it here, the cold would kill it, or the scent of blood would draw the scavengers, the chitinous skitter things that lived in the darker cracks of the canyon. He sighed a long, weary exhalation. 100% chance I regret this, he whispered to himself. He walked up to the creature's head. The massive jaws could snap him in half, but he knelt down. "I am going to touch you. Do not bite me. If you bite me, I'll drop you." The emerald eyes blinked slowly. Acknowledgement. Stephen moved to the creature's flank. He assessed the weight. It was dense muscle and bone. He grit his teeth, bent his knees, and slid his arms under the creature's torso, grabbing handfuls of thick fur for leverage. "On 3. 1, 2, 3, he heaved. A groan tore from his own throat as his lower back protested violently. The fox was heavier than a load of wet lumber. He staggered, boots slipping on the crushed rosemary, but he managed to lift the creature's front half, dragging the rest. "Okay," he grunted, waddling backward toward the open door. "You are just a giant gold sack of bricks." He managed to drag the creature into the living room, collapsing near the hearth. The fire was dying down, casting a warm orange glow. He pulled the fox onto the rug, arranging its limbs, so the wound on the flank was accessible. The creature let out a long sigh, its head resting on its paws, watching him. Stephen stood up, pressing a hand to his aching lumbar spine. "I saved a moaning carpet," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "My back is going to die before you do. That is a guarantee." He went to the kitchen, grabbing a basin of warm water, clean rags, and a jar of antiseptic salve he made from crushed aloe and medicinal moss. "Stay," he said over his shoulder, as if talking to a puppy and not a prehistoric apex predator. He returned to the living room, balancing the basin. He looked down at the rug. The basin slipped from his fingers. Splash. Water flooded the stone floor, soaking his boots. The giant fox was gone. In its place, curled up on the rug, was a woman. She was long-limbed and tall. Even curled up, he could tell she would tower over him. She had skin the color of polished bronze and hair that cascaded around her, like a spill of molten gold. But she was not entirely human. Large, triangular fox ears, covered in golden fur, twitched atop her head. A massive tail, thick and luxurious, was wrapped around her legs for warmth. Patches of fine golden fur ran along her forearms and down her spine. She was shivering, her skin pebbled with gooseflesh. The splash of water made her flinch. She opened her eyes, those same intelligent emerald eyes, and looked at Stephen. Then she looked at the puddle spreading toward her, soaking into the edge of the blanket he had thrown down. She frowned, her nose crinkling. "That was unnecessary." Her voice was husky, layered with a strange harmonic undertone, like two people speaking in perfect unison. Stephen stood there, mouth slightly open, water dripping from his pants. He pointed at the rug. "You were a fox." "I am Cathari," she said, sitting up slowly. She winced, her hand going to her side where the wound was. It was still there, a nasty gash on her human skin now. She looked at Stephen, then down at herself. She seemed to realize she was unclothed, though the strategic placement of her tail and hair provided some modesty. She looked at him with an accusatory arch of her eyebrow. "Did you undress me while I was unconscious?" Stephen spluttered, his face heating up. "What? No, you were a fox, a giant fox. I do not undress wildlife. I was getting water to clean your fur." "Calm down," she said, a faint smirk touching her lips despite her pain. "I am teasing. It is a coping mechanism for the fact that I am currently naked in a stranger's house and bleeding." Stephen quickly grabbed the throw blanket from the back of his armchair and tossed it to her. She caught it with reflex speed and wrapped it around herself, creating a makeshift toga. "Thank you," she said, her dignity returning as she covered herself. Stephen grabbed a towel to mop up the water, his mind racing. Cathari. He had heard stories. They lived in the high forest, the bioluminescent canopy, miles above. They were shapeshifters, reclusive, rarely descending into the stone valley. "I am Stephen," he said, wringing out the towel. "You are in Hearth Deep." "I know where I am," she said. She shifted, leaning back against the stone hearth. "I am Maddie, of the High Canopy clan." "Maddie," Stephen repeated. It was a surprisingly normal name for a giant, shape-shifting fox alien. "Is it difficult to pronounce?" "No. Just expected something with more vowels and apostrophes." "My true name would cause your tongue to tie in a knot and likely shatter your windows," Maddie said dryly. "Maddie is sufficient for interspecies dialogue." Stephen knelt down, keeping a respectful distance, and retrieved the jar of salve. "Your side. It needs cleaning." Maddie pulled the blanket aside, revealing the gash. It was deep, likely caused by falling rock. "I was investigating," she said, her voice tightening as Stephen applied the antiseptic. "The glass root is sick. Can you feel it?" Stephen's hand paused for a fraction of a second. "I feel the tremors." "It is more than tremors," Maddie hissed, as the medicine stung. "It is a fever. The network is pulsing with a frequency that is wrong. I was tracking a vein of corruption near the cliff edge. The ground just gave way. Liquidized. I fell 200 feet. "You are lucky to be alive," Stephen murmured, bandaging the wound efficiently. His hands were steady, practicing the muscle memory of a medic. "I shifted to my primal form to absorb the impact," Maddie explained. "But the slide buried me. Took me 3 hours to dig out. I crawled here." She looked at him, her expression softening. "I heard your house. Not noise, but a stillness. It felt safe." "I am glad my house has a good reputation," Stephen said, taping the bandage shut. "There, that should hold." "Thank you, Stephen." She looked him in the eyes, and for a moment the alien nature of her face faded, leaving just a raw human gratitude. "Most humans would have shot a beast of my size." "I thought about it," Stephen deadpanned. "But I did not want to clean the blood off my patio." Maddie let out a short, barking laugh. "Pragmatism. I like that." From the alcove, a small rustle broke the moment. Stephen stiffened. He turned to see Iris standing in the doorway of the sleeping nook, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her eyes were wide, taking in the scene, her father kneeling on the floor, the puddle of water, and the 7-foot-tall woman with fox ears wrapped in a blanket by the fire. "Papa," she whispered. Stephen stood up quickly, moving to intercept. "Iris, honey, go back to bed. We have a guest who had an accident." Iris didn't move back. She moved forward. She walked right past Stephen, her eyes locked on Maddie, specifically on the massive golden tail that was protruding from the bottom of the blanket. "You have a tail," Iris said, awe in her voice. Maddie froze, looking at the child. Then slowly, she uncurled the tail and gave it a gentle wave. "I do. It is quite useful for balance." Iris's face lit up with a brilliance that rivaled the forest above. "It is so fluffy." Maddie blinked, clearly, unused to this reaction. "I suppose it is. I groom it daily." "Are you a fox?" Iris asked, reaching out a hesitant hand. "I am Cathari," Maddie said. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her head to be closer to Iris's level. "But yes, I am part fox." Iris turned to Stephen, her face serious. "Papa, she is the big fluffy friend." Stephen rubbed his temples. The headache was throbbing again. "Iris, her name is Maddie, and she needs to rest." "Is she staying?" Iris asked. Stephen looked at Maddie. She was pale, the adrenaline fading, leaving her exhausted. Outside, the wind had picked up and the low hum of the glass root was increasing in volume, vibrating the dishes in the cupboard. A storm was brewing, a resonant storm. He couldn't kick her out. Not injured. Not with the ground shaking like this. "She is staying for tonight," Stephen said. Maddie looked around the small living room. There was the wooden armchair, which was too small for her. There was the rug, which was hard stone underneath. And there was the workshop, which was full of sawdust. She shifted awkwardly, pulling the blanket tighter. She looked at Stephen, her pride warring with her exhaustion. "So," Maddie asked quietly, her voice dropping so Iris wouldn't hear the vulnerability. "Where exactly am I going to sleep?" She glanced at the floor, clearly resigning herself to the stone. "No," Iris chimed in loudly. "The floor is hard. Papa says the floor is for feet, not for sleeping." Iris pointed a small finger toward the large bed in the corner, the bed with the empty space. "The big fluffy friend can sleep with us, Papa," Iris declared. "There is room. You always leave the big space empty." The room went silent. Stephen felt like he had been punched in the gut. He looked at the bed. He looked at the smooth, perfect quilt on the left side, the side he had defended against dust and disorder for 5 years, the side that belonged to a memory. He looked at Maddie. She was watching him carefully, her emerald eyes reading the pain he tried to hide. She began to shake her head. "I can sleep on the rug, Stephen. It is fine. I do not wish to intrude." "The rug is cold," Iris insisted, "and the ground is making the grumbling noise. She needs to be off the ground." The floor shuddered again, a distinct thump-thump from deep below, as if the planet were knocking on the door. Stephen looked at his daughter's hopeful face. He looked at the injured woman who had dragged herself out of a landslide. He looked at the empty expanse of the mattress. He realized with a sudden crushing clarity that preserving that empty space hadn't brought Anna back. It had only kept the cold in. Stephen let out a long breath. He walked over to the bed. With a decisive motion, he reached out and grabbed the corner of the pristine quilt, the corner he had smoothed out 20 minutes ago. He pulled it back, exposing the cool sheets. He looked at Maddie. "Right here," Stephen said, his voice rough but steady. Maddie hesitated, searching his face for any sign of reluctance. Finding only a weary acceptance, she nodded once. She stood up, staggering slightly, and walked to the bed. It was a tight fit. The bed was large, but Maddie was tall, and Iris was a sprawling sleeper. They settled in. It was the most awkward arrangement in the history of the galaxy. Iris was in the middle, radiating pure joy, hugging her stuffed rabbit. Maddie lay on the left on the Anna side, her massive tail draped over the edge of the bed, like a golden waterfall. She was stiff, careful not to touch anything, her ears flattened against her head. Stephen lay on the right, staring up at the stone ceiling. "Papa," Iris whispered. "Yes, Bug. This is cozy." "Go to sleep, Iris." "Good night, Maddie," Iris murmured. "Good night, little one," Maddie replied softly. Silence descended, save for the rhythmic breathing of the child. Stephen lay there hyper-aware of the warmth radiating from the other side of the bed. It wasn't the ghost he was used to. It was solid, heavy living heat. It smelled of ozone, crushed pine needles, and rain. For the first time in 5 years, the bed didn't feel like a vast, lonely tundra. It felt crowded. Beneath the floor, deep in the crust of Aurora's Rest, the glass root hummed a low, dissonant chord. Stephen felt it in his teeth. He knew with the instinct of a veteran that the peace of the valley was about to fracture. The inciting incident hadn't been the fox falling in his yard. That was just the arrival. The real event was starting down below. But as his eyes grew heavy, Stephen realized that for this one night, the monsters were outside, and the perimeter, bizarre as it was secure. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't dream of the war. He dreamed of gold and green fire. The morning suns of Aurora's Rest did not rise gently. They breached the canyon rim with a sudden blinding enthusiasm that turned the gray stone walls into curtains of burning ochre. Inside Stephen's house, the transition from night to day was marked not by light, but by the sound of cast iron colliding with stone. Clang. Stephen shot up in bed, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. His hand instinctively reached for a sidearm that had not existed for 10 years. He blinked, the adrenaline fading into a groggy confusion as he realized he was in his own home. He looked to his left. The space beside him was empty. The quilt was thrown back and there was a significant indentation in the mattress, lined with a few strands of long golden hair. Clang thud. "Oh, for the love of the stars," a husky voice muttered from the kitchen. Stephen rubbed his face, feeling the grit of sleep in his eyes. He swung his legs out of bed. Iris was already gone from her spot in the middle, likely drawn to the commotion, like a moth to a flame. He walked into the main living area, his socks sliding slightly on the smooth stone floor. The scene that greeted him in the kitchen was one of domestic catastrophe. Maddie was attempting to make breakfast. The operative word was attempting. She was in her human form, though calling it strictly human was a stretch given her height and the appendages. She had found one of Stephen's old flannel work shirts, which she had tied at the waist, but the sleeves were still short on her long arms. The real issue, however, was spatial awareness. Stephen's kitchen was built for a man of 6 feet. It was efficient, compact, and narrow. Maddie was nearly 7 feet tall, and she came with a tail that was roughly the size of a large body pillow. As she turned to flip something in a skillet, her massive golden tail swung around with the momentum of a wrecking ball. It swept a canister of dried oats off the counter. Iris, sitting on a stool nearby, let out a shriek of delighted laughter. "I have it," Maddie said, crouching down to catch the canister. As she crouched, her tail went up, knocking a hanging pot off the overhead rack. Clang. Stephen leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "The kitchen is surrendering," he said dryly. "You can stop attacking it." Maddie froze, holding a spatula like a weapon. She turned to look at him. Her emerald eyes narrowed, though her cheeks were flushed with a faint, bronze-colored embarrassment. Her ears were flattened against her skull. "I am not attacking it," she insisted, her voice resonating with that strange, beautiful harmonic. "I am attempting to synthesize nutrition. Your appliances are simply miniature and hostile." "The stove is standard size," Stephen pointed out. "For a species that lacks a counterbalance," Maddie retorted. She stood up, nearly grazing her head on the wooden rafters. As she straightened, she tucked her tail protectively around her leg, holding it there with one hand. "This environment is discriminatory against those with posterior accessories." Stephen walked over, gently taking the spatula from her hand. "Sit down, before you accidentally demolish a load-bearing wall." "I was making eggs," Maddie said, surrendering the cooking station but looking displeased about it. "I am perfectly capable of applying heat to protein." "I am sure you are," Stephen said, cracking an egg into the pan with one hand, a practiced fluid motion. "But this kitchen was not designed for a Cathari warrior. It is barely designed for me." "Do not body-shame my tail," Maddie grumbled, as she squeezed herself onto the bench next to Iris. "It is a sign of vitality and status in my clan. Here it is just a liability." "I like your tail," Iris chirped, reaching out to pat the golden fur. "It is soft, like a cloud, but made of dog." Maddie looked down at the child, her expression softening instantly. "Thank you, little one. Though I am closer to what you call a fox than a dog. Dogs are subservient. Cathari are sovereign." Stephen plated the eggs and set them on the table, along with a loaf of dense dark bread he had baked 2 days ago. He poured 3 mugs of herbal tea, steaming bitter and grounding. For a moment the only sound was the clinking of forks. It was a strange tableau. The veteran mechanic, the small girl, and the giant alien woman squeezed around a table meant for a much smaller family. Yet the strangeness was not uncomfortable. It felt steady, like a chair with 3 solid legs. "So," Stephen said, breaking the silence as he buttered a slice of bread. "Last night you said Glassroot was sick. You called it a fever." Maddie paused, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. The humor vanished from her face, replaced by a sharp, predatory seriousness. She set the bread down. "It is not a metaphor," Maddie said. "You know the legends. The glassroot is not just crystal. It is a semi-biological network. It drinks thermal energy from the core and distributes it to the surface. That is why the valley is warm. That is why the forest above glows." "I know the geology," Stephen said quietly. He kept his eyes on his plate. "Then you know it communicates," Maddie continued. "Usually it is a low hum, a background static, but 3 moons ago the sound changed. It started to itch." Stephen's hand tightened around his mug. He knew exactly what she meant. He had felt it starting 3 moons ago, a scratching sensation behind his eyes, a tinnitus that pitched up whenever he touched the bedrock. "Itching?" Iris asked, looking confused. "Like a mosquito bite?" "Like a scream that is too low to hear with your ears, but loud enough to feel in your teeth," Maddie explained gently to the child, before turning her gaze back to Stephen. "It is spreading. The corruption disrupts the energy flow. The roots become brittle. They crave expansion to bridge the gaps in the circuit. If we do not stop it, the glass root will consume the soil to replace its lost structure. The forest will die. Then the valley will turn to dust." Stephen took a sip of tea. It burned his throat, a welcome distraction. "And you came down here to fix it?" "I came to find the source," Maddie said. "The sickness is not natural. It feels induced, like a wound that has been agitated." She leaned forward, her eyes searching his face. "You live on the rock, Stephen. You must feel it. The tremors are not tectonic. They are spasms." Stephen felt the familiar throb at his temple. He could feel it right now, a subtle dissonant vibration traveling up through the floor, vibrating the bones of his ankles. It was a warning. "I get headaches," Stephen said dismissively. "Old injuries. The pressure changes in the valley affect everyone." It was a lie. A cowardly, safe lie. If he admitted he could hear the glassroot, he would have to explain why he could hear it. He would have to explain the metal plates fused to his skull, the resonance training the years spent deep underground in the sapper's core, listening for the frequency of stone so he could shatter it. Maddie watched him for a long moment. Her pupils constricted slightly, but she did not press him. "Perhaps," she said. "But the slide that brought me down yesterday was caused by a root bursting. It is getting closer to the surface." Stephen stood up abruptly, clearing his plate. "I have work to do. The storm door needs reinforcing if the tremors are getting worse, and the front frame is too low." He looked at Maddie, who was currently hunching slightly to avoid the light fixture. "If you are going to stay until your side heals," Stephen said, keeping his back to her as he washed the dish. "I cannot have you walking around with a concussion because you hit a beam." Maddie blinked, surprised. A slow smile spread across her face, showing just the tips of her elongated canines. "Are you offering to renovate your house to accommodate my height?" "I am offering to modify a door frame so you do not bleed on my floor again," Stephen grunted. "I just cleaned it." The day settled into a rhythm that felt dangerously comfortable. Stephen spent the morning in the workshop, but his attention was divided. Through the open window, he could hear Maddie and Iris in the courtyard. Maddie was seated on a large flat stone, her wound freshly bandaged, reading from one of Iris's storybooks. Her voice was mesmerizing, deep and resonant, adding a gravity to the children's tale about a rabbit who wanted to fly. And then, Maddie read, the rabbit realized that gravity was merely a suggestion provided one had sufficient velocity. That is not what it says, Iris giggled. It is the subtext, Maddie replied solemnly. The rabbit is clearly a student of physics. Stephen found himself smiling as he planed the wood for the new door header. He was carving a piece of red heart cedar, a wood that smelled of cinnamon and iron. He worked with the rhythmic, meditative motions of a man who found peace in tangible results. Wood was honest. If you cut it wrong, it was your fault. It didn't keep secrets. His mind drifted back to Anna. 10 years ago, Anna had been the one sitting on that stone. She had been a botanist fascinated by the interaction between the glassroot and the valley's crops. She used to say the planet was singing a lullaby. She died when a harvest tunnel collapsed. The official report said it was a geological instability. Stephen knew it was a resonance feedback loop. The glassroot had reacted to a mining drill snapped and brought the ceiling down. He had been 2 miles away, and he had felt her death, a sudden silence, where her heartbeat used to be. He had buried his gear in the metal box that night. He had sworn to Iris, who was just an infant then, that she would never know the smell of pulverized rock and ozone. Papa, look! Stephen looked up, shaking off the ghost. Iris was balancing a bucket of water on her head, mimicking Maddie, who was carrying 2 massive pails from the well, with effortless grace. Careful, Stephen called out, stepping out of the workshop. He met them at the door. Maddie set the pails down. She was not even out of breath. The sunlight caught the golden fuzz on her arms, making her glow. She has good balance, Maddie said, nodding at Iris. She would make a decent tree runner. She is a ground walker, Stephen said firmly, though not unkindly. He reached for one of the pails to bring it inside. Maddie reached for the same pail. Their hands brushed. It wasn't just skin touching skin. A static shock, audible and sharp, cracked between them. Stephen jerked his hand back and Maddie hissed, shaking her fingers. Static, Stephen muttered. Dry air. But it didn't feel static. It felt like a tuning fork being struck. A resonance. For a second, the headache behind his eyes had vanished, replaced by a sudden clear tone. Maddie was staring at her hand, then at him. Her ears were swiveled forward, twitching. That was substantial voltage. Carpet, Stephen said, though they were standing on stone. I will get the water. He grabbed the pail, careful not to touch her again, but the air between them hummed, with a tension that had nothing to do with electricity. It was the tension of 2 magnets being forced together, or pulled apart. He could feel her gaze on his back as he walked into the house. It was a heavy, curious weight. The illusion of peace shattered 3 days later. It was mid-morning. Stephen was in the workshop showing Iris how to sand a block of pine when the alarm bell rang. It was an old iron bell located in the center of the village, used for fires or collapses. The sound was harsh, clanging rhythmically. Clang, clang, clang. Stephen dropped the sanding block. Stay here, he told Iris. But Papa, stay, here. His voice was the voice of the sergeant he used to be. Iris froze, eyes wide. Stephen grabbed his heavy coat and ran out. Maddie was already in the courtyard, her nostrils flaring, scanning the wind. I smell sulfur, she said. And something sharp, like ozone. The bell is from the east, Stephen said. The Miller farm. I am coming, Maddie said. You should stay hidden, Stephen warned. People are on edge. If the glassroot is involved, you will need me, she replied, and without waiting for his permission, she began to run. She moved with a terrifying speed, her long legs eating up the distance far faster than any human could sprint. Stephen cursed and ran after her, his boots pounding the dust. When they arrived at the Miller farm, a crowd had already gathered. 30 or 40 villagers stood in a semicircle around the apple orchard, their faces pale, murmuring in fear. Stephen pushed through the crowd, Maddie following close behind, pulling the hood of her borrowed cloak over her ears. The scene in the orchard was a nightmare frozen in time. The apple trees were there, but they were no longer wood and leaf. They had been transmuted. The trunks were columns of smoky quartz. The leaves were razor-thin shards of emerald glass. The apples hung heavy and perfect, indistinguishable from the real fruit, except they were made of solid ruby-colored crystal. A goat had wandered into the perimeter. It stood frozen, not transformed, but trapped. Its hooves were encased in the glass soil fused to the ground. It bleated in terror. "Don't touch it!" Stephen shouted, as Farmer Miller reached out with a hoe to free the animal. Miller swung the hoe. The metal struck the glass soil. Crack. The sound was like a gunshot. A spiderweb fracture shot across the ground, reaching the glass tree. The entire tree shivered. Then, with a sound like 1,000 wind chimes falling at once, the tree shattered. It didn't just break. It exploded into dust and shards. The crowd screamed and scrambled back. Stephen threw his arm up to shield his face as glass dust coated the air. Miller fell back, scrambling away on his hands and knees. "It's cursed!" he screamed. "The land is cursed!" Stephen stared at the shattered remains of the tree. His heart was racing so fast it hurt. He had seen this before. In the deep campaigns 10 years ago, they had called it vitrification. It happened when the glassroot was subjected to a specific high-frequency sonic bombardment. It turned organic matter into crystal structures to conduct the energy, then shattered them when the load became too high. This wasn't natural sickness. This was a weaponized reaction. But there were no weapons here. "What is this?" A harsh voice cut through the panic. Farron, the village elder, stepped forward. He was a thick-set man with a beard like steel wool and eyes that looked for things to blame. He pointed a trembling finger at the glass orchard, then turned his gaze to Maddie, who stood silently behind Stephen. "We never had glass trees before," Farron spat. "Not until the stray dog showed up." The crowd turned. The fear in their eyes shifted instantly to anger. It was an easy transition. Fear needed a target, and a 7-foot-tall alien was a perfect one. "She is Cathari!" Farron shouted. "They live with the roots up in the forest. Maybe she brought the rot down with her. Maybe she is poisoning the soil to drive us out." "That is biologically impossible," Maddie said, her voice calm but cold. "I am flesh and blood. I cannot transmute cellulose to silica." "You shift your shape," Farron countered, stepping closer. "You change your bones. Why can't you change the trees?" "Farron, stop it." Stephen stepped in, positioning himself between the elder and Maddie. "This is not her doing. The glassroot has been unstable for months." "And you have been hiding her," Farron turned on Stephen. "We saw the lights at your place. We heard the noise. You are harboring a beast, Stephen. A beast that brings bad luck." "She is a guest," Stephen said, his voice low and dangerous. "And she helped fix the aqueduct seal yesterday. She is earning her keep." "She is a monster," Miller yelled from the ground. "Look at my farm ruined." Stephen looked at the angry faces. These were his neighbors, people he had built tables for. But fear made them strangers. He wanted to scream at them. He wanted to tell them he knew what this was. He wanted to tell them that he was the only one who understood the physics of what was happening because he had once been a monster who caused it. But the words died in his throat. If he told them he was a sapper, a root burner, they wouldn't just banish Maddie. They would burn his house down. They would take Iris away from a war criminal. So he said nothing. He stood there, a mute shield vibrating with cowardice and rage. Maddie looked at Stephen's back. She saw the tension in his shoulders. She saw his hands clenched into fists, not to fight, but to stop himself from speaking. She realized he was protecting a secret more than he was protecting her. "We are leaving," Stephen said tightly. He grabbed Maddie's arm. "We are going back." He turned and marched her away, leaving the crowd muttering and casting hateful glares at their backs. The walk back was silent. The air was thick with unsaid words. When they reached the house, Iris was waiting in the yard playing near the herb garden. She was piling stones into a small tower. "Did you see the fire?" Iris asked innocently. The bell rang. "It wasn't a firebug," Stephen said, his voice exhausted. "Just broken glass." He walked past her, needing to sit down, needing the darkness of the house. Maddie lingered outside, watching Iris. "Be careful, little one," Maddie said softly. "The ground is uneasy today." "I know," Iris said. "It is tickling my feet." Iris took a step toward a patch of bare earth near the canyon wall. Suddenly, the ground gave a violent lurch. It wasn't a tremor. It was a heave. A crack opened in the sandstone, jagged and fast-running directly between Iris's feet. "Iris!" Stephen roared, spinning around from the doorway. Violet light erupted from the crack. A spur of glass root sharp as a spear shot upward. Iris stumbled, falling backward, her small hand sliding toward the widening fissure. Stephen didn't think. He didn't calculate. He reacted. He threw himself across the yard, sliding on his knees. He didn't reach for Iris. He couldn't reach her in time. Instead, he slammed his open palm onto the earth, directly onto the rock beside the crack. He didn't just hit the ground. He pushed his will into it. He closed his eyes and let the hum in his head release. He matched the frequency of the dissonance, the itching noise, and then he inverted it. He created a counter-resonance in his bones and drove it into the bedrock. Thud. The sound was low, barely audible, but it hit the stomach like a cannonball. The violet light in the crack flickered and died. The spur of glass root stopped rising, instantly freezing in place. The earth stopped shaking. The crack did not close, but it stabilized, the edges hardening. Iris sat there dusty and wide-eyed, but safe. Stephen stayed kneeling, his hand pressed to the dirt, panting. His nose was bleeding. A single drop of crimson fell onto the sandstone. Silence hung heavy in the courtyard. Slowly, Stephen lifted his head. Maddie was standing 10 feet away. She wasn't looking at Iris. She was looking at Stephen's hand. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated to black discs. Her ears were swiveled forward, trembling. She had felt it. She had felt the artificial resonance. No human hand could stabilize a geological event just by touching it. That required a somatic amplifier, or a body that had been altered to be one. Stephen wiped the blood from his nose, standing up shakily. He went to Iris, scooping her up and checking her for scratches. "I'm okay, Papa," Iris whispered, burying her face in his neck. "You made the ground stop." Stephen looked over Iris's shoulder at Maddie. Maddie stared back. The warmth was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating recognition. The root burner, she thought. The frequency is identical to the scorched zones in the high forest. She took a step back. Every instinct in her Cathari blood screamed at her to shift, to attack, to tear the throat out of the creature that had decimated her ancestral hunting grounds. This man was not a carpenter. He was a weapon. But then she looked at his hands. Those same hands that had just suppressed a quake were now trembling as they stroked his daughter's hair. He was murmuring soft, nonsensical comforts to the child, pressing a kiss to her dusty temple. He looked terrified. Not of Maddie, but of the fact that his daughter had almost been hurt. The monster was shaking because he loved something. Maddie's claws, which had begun to extend, retracted slowly. He is a root burner, she told herself. But he just used the burn to save, not to destroy. "Stephen," Maddie said. Her voice was guarded testing. Stephen flinched. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Don't say it. Don't say it in front of her." "We should go inside," Maddie said slowly. "The air is getting cold." She didn't expose him. She didn't attack. She turned and held the door open. Stephen exhaled a sound like a dying man and carried Iris inside. Maddie watched him pass. She would stay. She had to stay now. Not just because of the glass root, but because she had to know if a weapon could truly learn to be a father. And if he was dangerous, she needed to be the one standing between him and the world, or between the world and him. Night fell, bringing a heavy, suffocating darkness to the valley. The dinner had been quiet. Iris, exhausted by the adrenaline, had fallen asleep early. Now, the house was dark. The three of them were back in the bed. It had become a silent agreement. No one suggested the floor. Iris lay in the middle, her breathing deep and even. Her left hand held Stephen's index finger. Her right hand gripped a tuft of Maddie's fur. Stephen lay on his back, staring at the ceiling shadows. His headache was blinding now, a constant drilling pain. He knew Maddie knew. He could feel her wakefulness on the other side of the bed. She was tense, coiled. "The orchard," Maddie whispered into the dark. She didn't turn her head. "I know," Stephen whispered back. "It will happen again. Bigger." "I know." "You cannot stop it by hitting the dirt, Stephen. Not forever." "I know." Silence stretched between them, thick and fragile. "Why didn't you tell them?" Maddie asked. "At the farm. You knew what it was." "Because if I tell them what I know," Stephen said, his voice cracking slightly, "they will ask how I know. And then they will not let me keep her." He squeezed Iris's hand gently. Maddie shifted. The bed creaked. She turned on her side, looking at his profile in the gloom. She reached out, her large hand hovering over his arm, then settling lightly on his shoulder. It was a heavy, grounding weight. "You are not alone in this bed, Stephen," she said softly. "And you are not alone in this fight. Sleep." Stephen closed his eyes. He didn't deserve her kindness. He was the enemy of her people. If she knew the full truth, that he wasn't just a soldier, but the architect of the burning, she would gut him. But he was too tired to argue. He drifted into a restless sleep. Beneath the floor, deep in the roots of the world, the hum changed. It wasn't a vibration anymore. It was a melody. A discordant, screeching melody of glass grinding on glass. Cree-thrum. The sound rose, piercing the bedrock. It wasn't a drift. It was a surge. The glass root was waking up, and this time it was angry. The floorboards groaned. The water in the bedside glass began to ripple, forming concentric rings that grew more violent with every second. Stephen's eyes snapped open. Maddie sat up, her ears swiveling toward the floor. The rising action was over. The climax had arrived. The dawn did not break. It shattered. Stephen was awake before his eyes opened. The sensation was not a sound, but an intrusion, a violation of his own skeleton. It started in the marrow of his shin bones, traveled up his spine, and detonated at the base of his skull. It was a frequency he knew intimately, a vibration that tasted like copper and old blood. The water in the ceramic bowl on the nightstand was not merely rippling, it was dancing. Small droplets levitated from the surface, suspended in the air by the sheer force of the acoustic pressure rising from the bedrock. "Stephen," Maddie's voice cut through the hum. She was already sitting up, her ears pressed flat against her skull, her lips pulled back to reveal the tips of her teeth. Her emerald eyes were wide, the pupils dilated until the green was a thin, panicked ring. "I feel it," Stephen said, swinging his legs out of bed. The floorboards groaned, the wood twisting against the stone foundation. This was not the settling of the house. This was the planet trying to shake the house off its back. "It is not a drift," Maddie hissed, her tail lashing violently against the quilt. "It is a surge. The glass root is screaming." A fist hammered against the front door. Thud, thud, thud. "Vet, open up, vet." Stephen was moving before the third knock landed. He didn't grab a shirt. He grabbed the heavy lantern from the hook and threw the bolt. Standing in the wind-whipped courtyard was Cale, a teenager who usually ran messages for the council. The boy's face was the color of curdled milk. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving. "The source," Cale choked out, pointing up toward the high plateau where the community's water cistern was carved into the mountain. "The elder sent me. The roof is singing." Stephen's blood ran cold. "Singing and cracking," Cale wept. "It is cracking." Stephen did not ask for details. He spun around. "Iris, get your boots!" Iris was already scrambling out of the bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide with the reflection of the lantern light. She did not cry. She was a child of the frontier. She knew that panic was a luxury they could not afford. "Maddie," Stephen said, his voice dropping to a command frequency. "Stay close to Iris. If the roof goes, the water will hit the valley floor in 6 minutes. You run for the high ridge. Do not wait for me." "I am not running," Maddie said, her voice dropping an octave, the harmonic undertone turning into a growl. She stood to her full height, the blanket falling away, to reveal she was already dressed in the tunics she had borrowed. "If the source collapses, the glass root will feed on the hydro energy and explode. There will be no high ridge left." Stephen looked at her. He saw the warrior, not the refugee. "Then move," he said. The run up to the source was a nightmare of shifting gravity. The ground beneath their feet rolled like the deck of a ship in a storm. The source was a massive natural cavern, located 300 feet above the village. It held millions of gallons of filtered aquifer water, the lifeblood of Hearthdeep. If the containment failed, the deluge would scrub the valley clean of life before burying it in rubble. When they crested the final ridge, the scene that greeted them was apocalyptic. The entrance to the cavern was glowing, not with lantern light but with the sickly, violent violet light of the glass root. The parasitic crystal had erupted from the cavern walls. It was no longer the slow creeping veins Stephen had seen in the orchard. These were massive pulsing arteries of glass, thick as tree trunks, shooting out of the stone. They were growing visibly inch by agonizing inch, reaching toward the vaulted ceiling of the cave. The air was filled with a high-pitched shrieking sound, the sound of stone being tortured. A crowd of 50 or 60 villagers was gathered near the entrance, milling in chaotic terror. Some were trying to shore up the entrance with timber beams that looked like toothpicks against the scale of the destruction. Others were simply screaming. "Get back!" Farron's voice roared over the din. The elder was standing on a crate, waving a torch. "It is unsafe, fall back." Stephen shoved his way through the crowd, Maddie and Iris close on his heels. "Farron!" Stephen shouted. "What is the structural integrity?" Farron turned. His eyes were wild red-rimmed from smoke and fear. When he saw Stephen, relief washed over his face, instantly replaced by a twisted, hateful sneer when he saw the towering shape of Maddie behind him. "You brought it!" Farron screamed, pointing the torch at Maddie. Look at the glass, it is reaching for her." It was true in a way. As Maddie approached, the violet light in the cave seemed to flare brighter, reacting to the bioelectricity of a Cathari. The glass spikes closest to the entrance vibrated, humming a discordant greeting. "She is feeding it!" a woman in the crowd shrieked. "The witch is feeding the rock." "No!" Maddie shouted, her hands raised. "It is reacting to my resonance. I can help calm it." "Calm it," Farron laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound. "You woke it up. We never had this until you crawled out of the dirt." The crowd surged forward. Fear had found its focal point. They didn't understand the complex geophysics of a planetary, semi-biological network. They understood that there was a monster and there was a disaster, and the two things were connected. Farron reached into his belt and pulled out a long, serrated skinning knife. "We kill the connection!" Farron yelled, stepping toward Maddie. "Drive the beast back to the hell it came from, and the stone will sleep." Maddie froze. She could snap Farron in half with one hand. She was an apex predator, but she saw the fear in the eyes of the villagers' people she had wanted to protect. If she fought back, she proved them right. If she hurt a human, she became the monster they claimed she was. She lowered her hands, making herself smaller. "Get away!" Farron lunged the knife, flashing in the violet light. "No!" A small blur shot out from behind Stephen's legs. Iris threw herself between the 7-foot alien and the charging man. She stood there, arms spread wide, her small chest heaving, shielding Maddie's legs. "Do not hurt the big friend," Iris screamed. Farron stumbled trying to stop his momentum, but he was heavy and moving fast. The knife waved wildly inches from Iris's face. Time stopped for Stephen. The world narrowed down to a single focal point, the glint of steel near his daughter's eye. The carpenter vanished. The man who made rocking chairs and fixed fences evaporated. In his place stood Sergeant Stephen Vance of the 4th Subterranean Sappers. He moved with a violence that was terrifying in its efficiency. Stephen stepped in his left hand, chopping Farron's wrist with a sickening crack. As the knife fell, Stephen caught it in midair, not to use but to discard. He spun Farron around, kicking the back of the man's knee, forcing him to the ground, and pinned him with a boot to the throat. It took less than 2 seconds. Stephen stood over the elder, his chest rising and falling slowly. His eyes were cold, dead things. He looked up at the stunned crowd. The silence was absolute, broken only by the shrieking of the rocks. "If anyone," Stephen said, his voice low, but carrying across the plateau like a thunderclap, "takes a step toward my family, I will break them. Are we clear?" The villagers stared. They had never seen the vet like this. They had seen him carry lumber. They had never seen him neutralize a threat with military precision. "Stephen," Farron wheezed from under the boot. What are you?" Stephen stepped back, releasing the man. He turned to face the cavern mouth, where the glass was now creeping across the ceiling, forming a web of heavy crystal that threatened to pull the roof down by its sheer weight. "This is not a curse," Stephen addressed the crowd, stripping away the lies he had lived with for years. "And it is not her fault. This is a glassroot awakening. Phase 4. He pointed at the pulsing veins. "The root has gone septic. It is trying to cauterize the wound by turning everything around it into conductor material. If that ceiling turns to glass, it will shatter under the water pressure. You have 5 minutes before this valley becomes a grave." "How do you know?" a farmer asked, his voice trembling. "How do you know the phases?" Stephen looked at the man. "Because I used to trigger them. I was a sapper in the Deep Wars." A gasp ran through the crowd. The legend of the root burners, the soldiers who used sonic weaponry to turn the enemy's tunnels into glass coffins, was a horror story told to children. And one of them had been fixing their furniture for a decade. "We do not have time for your judgment," Stephen snapped. He turned to Maddie. "Can you hold the entrance? Keep the civilians back." Maddie looked at him. She saw the soldier. She saw the killer. But she also saw the father who had just moved faster than a striking snake to save his child. "I can hold the line," Maddie said. "Good. Iris, stay with Maddie." Stephen turned and sprinted. Not away from the danger, but back toward his house. He reached his front door in 3 minutes, his lungs burning. He kicked the door open and went straight to the locked metal box in the corner. He didn't bother with the biometric scanner. It would take too long to boot up. He grabbed a pry bar from his workbench and jammed it into the seam of the lid. With a roar of effort, he wrenched the metal upward. The lock sheared with a screech of protesting steel. The lid clattered back. Inside, nestled in decaying foam, lay the ghosts of his past. The resonance harness. It was a bulky, ugly thing, a framework of matte black metal that strapped over the chest and shoulders, connected to a throat mic and a series of tuning forks and amplifiers. It smelled of old sweat and ozone. He pulled it out. It was heavy. He stripped off his coat and pulled the harness on. The straps were tight. He had gained muscle since the war. He clicked the buckles shut. Click, click, click. The sound was the sound of a coffin closing. He flipped the power switch on the chest unit. A high-pitched whine started up, ascending, until it passed out of human hearing range. The lights on the unit flickered from red to amber. Stephen grabbed the 2 handheld emitter rods from the box. They looked like batons tipped with iridium. He caught his reflection in the window. He looked like a monster. He looked exactly like what Farron said he was. "Papa," Stephen spun around. He hadn't realized they had followed him down. Maddie stood in the doorway, Iris in her arms. Maddie was staring at the harness. Her face was drained of all color. Her lips were parted in horror. "That," Maddie whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the device on his chest. "That is a Type 7 sonic disruptor." Stephen didn't deny it. "Yes. That is the machine." Maddie's voice shook, tears welling in her emerald eyes. "That is the machine that burned the Whispering Woods. That is the machine that killed my brother." The truth hung between them, heavier than the mountain. Stephen was not just a veteran. He was a root burner. He was the bogeyman of her people. "Maddie," Stephen said. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to explain the orders, the ignorance, the war. "The cavern is going to fall. The frequency of the glass is climbing. I can stop it, but I need to get back up there." Maddie looked at the harness. It was an instrument of genocide. It was designed to vibrate the glass root until it exploded, liquefying the enemy inside the tunnels. "You are going to use it to break the cave?" she asked. "No," Stephen said. "I am going to use it to sing the glass to sleep. I am going to invert the frequency. But I cannot do it alone. The payload is too heavy. I need a spotter." He looked at her. "I need someone who can hear the earth." Maddie looked at the man she had slept beside. She looked at the weapon strapped to his chest. Then she looked at Iris, who was clinging to her neck, terrified of the noise coming from the mountain. If she let her hatred win, the water would fall. Iris would die. Maddie set Iris down gently. "Iris," Maddie said, her voice steady. "Stay here. Under the heavy table, do not come out until we come back." "Maddie," Iris whimpered. "We are going to shout at the rocks," Maddie said. She stood up and turned to Stephen. Her eyes were hard, fierce. "If you burn the forest again, Stephen, I will kill you myself." "Deal," Stephen said. They reached the cavern just as the first massive crack appeared in the ceiling. A shard of rock, the size of a wagon, detached and fell into the dark water below. Splash. The wave slapped against the sides of the cistern. "Everyone back!" Stephen roared, his voice amplified by the throat mic booming like a god's command. The villagers scattered, terrified by the sight of the vet in his black mechanical armor. Stephen and Maddie ran into the mouth of the cave. The heat inside was intense. The violet light was blinding. The glass root had covered 70% of the walls. It was pulsing rapidly now, thump, 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 like a heart in tachycardia. "It is trying to birth," Maddie yelled over the shrieking noise. "It thinks the cave is an egg." "I am going to interrupt the signal," Stephen shouted. He planted his feet wide on the stone ledge overlooking the water. He raised the two emitter rods. He closed his eyes and listened. He ignored the screaming of the civilians outside. He ignored the fear in his own gut. He listened for the root note, the fundamental frequency of the glass root. There it was, a sharp, grinding D-sharp oscillating wildly. Stephen keyed the mic. He opened his mouth and let out a low, guttural tone. "Hum!" The harness seized his voice, stripped it, amplified it 1,000 times, and fired it out of the emitters. The air in the cave rippled. The violet light flickered. The glass vines stopped growing for a second, confused by the countersignal. "It is working," Maddie shouted. But then the glass root adapted. The frequency shifted. It jumped an octave higher, screaming louder, pushing back against Stephen's wave. Spikes of glass shot out from the walls, aiming for them. Stephen dodged a razor-sharp crystal, missing his head by inches. "It is too strong," Stephen grunted, sweat pouring down his face. The harness was digging into his ribs, heating up. "I cannot match the pitch. It is shifting too fast." "It is a chorus," Maddie realized. "It is not one voice, it is 1,000. She looked at Stephen. He was red-faced, veins bulging in his neck, the emitters shaking in his hands. He was losing. The ceiling gave a groan, a long, tearing sound. Dust rained down. Maddie stepped forward. She didn't have a harness. She didn't have iridium rods. But she had lungs that were built to call across canyons, and a throat structure that could mimic the wind. She grabbed Stephen's hand. Her grip was crushing. "Stephen!" she yelled. "Do not fight it. Harmonize with it." "I don't know the song," he yelled back, his voice straining. "I do." Maddie pulled him closer. She dropped to her knees beside him, dragging him down. She placed her forehead directly against his. It was a Cathari gesture of absolute trust, exposing the skull, the mind. "Breathe with me," she commanded. Stephen opened his eyes. All he could see was emerald green. He felt her breath on his face, hot and fast. Maddie threw her head back and unleashed a sound that was not human. It was a howl, but it was melodic. It was a mournful, soaring note that wove through the screeching of the glass. It was the song the Cathari sang to the forest when the winter was too long. Stephen felt the vibration of her voice travel through her hand into his arm and into the harness. The machine spiked. The amber lights turned to a steady, blinding blue. Stephen understood. She was the carrier wave. He was the amplifier. He adjusted the dials on his chest. He matched her pitch. He opened his throat and poured everything he had into the mic, not a counterattack, but a harmony. The sound that filled the cave was deafening. It was a chord of pure, resonating power. "Ow, hum!" The glass root reacted instantly. The violet fire turned soft blue. The aggressive, jagged spikes that were reaching for the ceiling stopped, shuddered, and then began to curve. They softened. They bent back on themselves, weaving together into a lattice, a support structure. The ceiling stopped cracking. The glass wasn't breaking the rock. It was holding it up. "Hold it!" Maddie screamed, her voice cracking. "It is stabilizing!" "I can't," Stephen gasped. The harness was overheating. The metal on his chest was searing his skin. The feedback loop was rattling his teeth loose. 3 more seconds. Maddie pressed her forehead harder against his. "Stay with me, soldier." "If we survive this," Stephen wheezed, his vision tunneling, "next date dinner, not a collapsing cave." Maddie let out a hysterical, strained laugh in the middle of her howl. "In my culture, this is considered highly romantic." Crack, boom. A final surge of energy exploded from the emitters. The blue light flared white-hot, blinding them both. Then silence. The shrieking stopped. The water stopped slapping the walls. Stephen slumped forward. The harness power died with a whining whimper. He fell, but he didn't hit the stone. Maddie caught him. She held him against her chest, her heart hammering against his. She looked up. The cave was transformed. The menacing parasitic vines were gone. In their place was a magnificent glowing cathedral of blue crystal. The glass had formed heavy, arched pillars that supported the cracked roof. It was no longer a cancer. It was a skeleton. The water was safe. "We did it," Maddie whispered. Her voice was raw, a rasping shadow of itself. Stephen didn't answer. His head lolled back on her shoulder. His nose was bleeding freely now, and the skin on his chest was burned where the harness had shorted out. "Stephen!" He was unconscious. Maddie gathered him up. He was heavy, weighted down by the metal gear, but she lifted him with a grunt of effort. She cradled him like a child. She walked out of the cave entrance. The suns had fully risen now. The light hit the plateau, illuminating the dust and the fear. The villagers were still there, huddled in a wide semicircle. They stared at the cave mouth, waiting for the water to come crashing down to kill them. Instead, they saw the wolf woman emerge. She was covered in rock dust and blue pollen. Her eyes were fierce, glowing with power. And in her arms, she carried the root burner. Farron was standing at the front, nursing his broken wrist. He stared at the blue glow emanating from the cave behind her, a steady, healthy light. Maddie stopped. She looked at Farron. She looked at the crowd. "The water is safe," she rasped. Her voice was broken, but it carried the weight of a queen. "The root is sleeping." She didn't wait for their applause, and she didn't wait for their stones. She adjusted her grip on Stephen, pulling him tighter against her warmth. "Make way," she growled. The crowd parted. They parted like the Red Sea. They looked at Stephen's limp form, at the terrifying machine strapped to him, and then at the alien woman who carried him with such savage tenderness. Fear was still there, but beneath the fear, there was something new. Awe. Maddie walked through the gauntlet of eyes, her head high, her tail twitching with exhaustion. She had to get him home. She had to get him to the bed. Because the war was over for the night, but the reckoning was just beginning. The consciousness returned to Stephen in slow, disjointed fragments. First came the smell, the sharp medicinal tang of crushed aloe, and the earthy scent of drying mud. Then came the sound, the scratching of charcoal on parchment, rhythmic and deliberate. Finally, the sensation of weight, a heavy warmth pressing against his left side, anchoring him to the mattress. He opened his eyes. The ceiling was his own. The familiar cracks in the sandstone, the heavy timber beams he had installed himself 3 years ago, the spider web in the corner that he had promised to clear away last week. He was home. He tried to shift his position, but a dull, throbbing ache in his chest pinned him down. He looked down. His chest was wrapped in thick layers of linen bandages, smelling of the herbal paste the village healers used for burns. Sitting cross-legged by his hip was Iris. She had a piece of charcoal in one hand and was drawing directly onto his bandages. "Iris," Stephen croaked. His throat felt like he had swallowed a handful of desert sand. Iris jumped the charcoal, skidding across the linen. Her face, smudged with black dust, lit up. "Papa!" She dropped the charcoal and leaned over him, careful not to touch his chest. "You are awake? I was drawing a map." Stephen looked at the jagged black lines on his chest. "A map to where?" "To the kitchen," Iris whispered conspiratorially. "So you do not get lost when you go to get snacks." Stephen managed a weak smile. He turned his head to the left. Maddie was there. She was sitting in the heavy wooden armchair pulled right up to the bedside. Her head was resting on the mattress, her face turned toward him, fast asleep. Her large, triangular ears were drooped low, a sign of utter exhaustion. One of her hands was resting near his shoulder palm, open, as if she had been checking his temperature before she drifted off. Her massive golden tail was curled around the chair legs, like a sleeping python. "She carried you," Iris whispered, leaning close to Stephen's ear. "All the way down the mountain. Everyone was staring. She looked very scary and very cool." "She is strong," Stephen rasped. "I know," Iris nodded sagely. "I told her that you are heavy. I told her you sometimes pretend to be weak so you do not have to carry the firewood, but she said you were actually tired this time." Stephen let out a breath that was half laugh, half groan. "I do not pretend to be weak, Bug." "Grandma Miller says men like to be baby-ed," Iris quoted, with the absolute authority of a 7-year-old. Stephen closed his eyes for a moment, letting the domesticity of the scene wash over him. It was a stark contrast to the screaming violet fire of the cave. He was alive. Iris was safe. The water was holding. But as he breathed, he felt the shadow in the room. In the corner, propped against the wardrobe, sat the resonance harness. It was scorched, the black metal casing warped from the heat overload, the iridium emitters dull and gray. It looked like a dead insect carcass, ugly and threatening even in repose. He shouldn't have brought it out. He had saved the town, yes, but he had opened a door that could never be closed again. The next 2 days were a blur of visitors and uncomfortable gratitude. News traveled fast in Hearthdeep, but rumors traveled faster. The story of the vet calming the glass root had mutated. Some said he had wrestled the stone spirit. Others said he had commanded it with a demon's voice. They came to the door with offerings, baskets of tubers, jars of pickled heavy root, loaves of bread wrapped in cloth. Stephen sat up in bed, propped by pillows, nodding politely as Mrs. Gable, the baker, set a tray of pastries on the bedside table. "We are just so thankful, Stephen," she said, wringing her flour-dusted hands. Her eyes darted to the black harness in the corner, then quickly away, as if looking at it would burn her retinas. "When the roof started to crack, we thought it was the end." The structure was sounder than it looked. Stephen lied his voice flat. We just reinforced the load-bearing points. With singing, Mrs. Gable said nervously. That is what Cale said. He said you sang the rocks into submission. It is a technique, Stephen said. Acoustic stabilization. Well, she backed away toward the door. It is a miracle. A terrifying miracle. You rest now, Stephen. She fled. That was the word for it. She didn't leave. She fled. Maddie stood by the fireplace, peeling an apple with a paring knife. She watched the woman go, then looked at Stephen. They are afraid of you, Maddie said. Her tone was neutral, but her ears were swiveled back. I know, Stephen said. He looked at the harness. They should be. You saved their lives, Maddie pointed out. She sliced a piece of apple and walked over, holding it out to him. Stephen took the slice. I saved their lives by showing them I am a weapon. People like to have a hammer in the toolbox, Maddie, but they do not want to have dinner with it. You are a very mopey hammer, Maddie said dryly. Eat your fruit. Later that afternoon, Garen came by. The old farmer stood in the doorway, twisting his hat in his hands. He looked at Maddie, who was sitting on the rug, helping Iris braid her doll's hair, and then at Stephen. Afternoon vet, Garen said. Garen, Stephen nodded. The orchard, Garen started clearing his throat. The glass dust settled. The soil is dead, Stephen. Nothing grows where the glass shattered. But up at the cistern, where you did your thing, the moss is growing on the blue crystals. It is growing faster than before. Stephen stiffened. Blue glass is stable. It conducts life energy. Violet glass consumes it. Garen nodded slowly. My grandfather fought in the deep wars. He used to tell stories about the root burners. Said they wore black iron. Said they could turn a tunnel into a coffin in 3 seconds. The room went silent. Iris stopped braiding. Maddie's knife paused over the apple. Garen looked Stephen in the eye. He said the root burners were monsters, but he never said they could make the moss grow. The old man put his hat back on. I brought you some goat cheese. It is on the porch. Reckon you need the protein. He left. Stephen stared at the open door. It was a peace offering, but it was heavy with implication. We know what you are, the cheese said, but we will eat your food as long as you point the fire away from us. The real test came on the third evening. Stephen had moved from the bed to the armchair near the fire. His chest still ached, but his legs were working again. Maddie was in the kitchen attempting to make tea without destroying any more cookware. There was a heavy knock at the door, not a polite knock, a demand. It is open, Stephen called out, his hand instinctively, tightening on the armrest. Farron walked in. The elder's arm was in a sling, a stark white contrast to his dark woolen coat. His face was pale, his eyes hard and unyielding. He didn't look at Maddie. He didn't look at Iris, who was coloring on the floor. He walked straight to Stephen. Elder, Stephen said, not rising. Stephen, Farron acknowledged. He pulled a wooden stool over and sat down, wincing as his broken wrist jarred. Dr. Aris set the bone. Said it was a clean break, professional. I did not want to shatter it, Stephen said calmly. I just wanted you to drop the knife. I was trying to protect the village, Farron said, his voice rising slightly. That creature, he jerked his head toward the kitchen, was agitating the source. She was stabilizing the resonance, Stephen corrected. Without her, I would have burned out in 20 seconds and you would be underwater right now. Farron waved his good hand dismissively. Details. The point is, the threat is gone for now. But the glass root is still there. It is still under us. It is waiting. Farron leaned forward. The council met this morning. We discussed the equipment you have. He glanced at the scorched harness. We know what it can do, Stephen. We know you can dial that frequency up. You can make the glass brittle. You can shatter it deep down where it connects to the core. Stephen felt a cold stone settle in his stomach. No. Listen to me, Farron hissed. Next time it won't just be the cistern. It will be the foundations of our houses. It will be the fields. We cannot live on top of a sleeping dragon. You have the weapon. You need to go down to the main junction and burn it. Burn it all the way to the mantle. Sterilize the valley." "If I do that," Stephen said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage, "I kill the forest. The Cathari lands above depend on the root network for heat. If I shatter the core connection, the high forest freezes. Thousands will die." "They are animals," Farron snapped. "They are not us. Look at your daughter, Stephen. Do you want her to fall into a crack next time? Do you want to wake up and find your house swallowed by glass vines?" Stephen looked past Farron. Through the window, he could see the courtyard. Iris had run outside to catch fireflies. She wasn't alone. A small, furry shape, a Cathari kit barely 3 feet tall, had wandered down from the tree line. It was chasing the fireflies with Iris. They were laughing. 2 different species playing under the same dangerous starlight. "Look outside, Farron," Stephen said softly. Farron didn't turn. "I am looking at you. I am looking at a man who has the power to save his people, and is refusing because of what guilt sentiment?" "Because it is murder," Stephen said. "I won't do it. I won't use the burn again." Farron stood up. His face was twisted with frustration. "You think you have a choice when the ground starts shaking again when the next child dies? That blood is on you. You are a soldier, Stephen. Stop pretending to be a saint." Farron marched out, slamming the door hard enough to make the dust rattle from the rafters. Stephen sat in the silence. The fire crackled. "You are a soldier." The memory hit him like a physical blow. He was 24. The tunnel was dark, lit only by the violet pulse of the enemy route. The captain's voice in his ear. "Target confirmed. Resonance Alpha, maximum gain." Stephen had adjusted the dials. He hadn't thought about the biology. He had just thought about the mission. He hit the switch. The sound. It wasn't a hum. It was a scream that tore the world apart. The tunnel walls didn't just break. They turned to liquid, then to dust. And through the dust he heard them. Not monsters. Not beasts. Voices. Crying out in a language he didn't understand, but with a tone that needed no translation. Mothers, calling for children. The sound of flesh, meeting collapsing stone. He had burned the root, and he had burned the soul out of himself. "Stephen," Maddie's voice pulled him back. She was standing in front of him, holding a mug of tea. Her eyes were searching his face. She had heard Farron. She had heard everything. "I am fine," Stephen lied. He took the tea. His hand was shaking so badly the liquid sloshed over the rim. "You are shaking," Maddie said. "Low blood sugar," Stephen said, taking a sip. "And Farron is exhausting." Maddie didn't press him. She knelt down beside the chair, her golden eyes level with his. She reached out and placed her hand over his trembling one. Her skin was warm, calloused and comforting. "You said no," Maddie whispered. "You told him you would not burn the forest." "I told him I would not commit genocide," Stephen said. "That is a low bar for morality, Maddie." "For a human," Maddie tilted her head. "It is a surprisingly high bar." The recovery process was slow, filled with the awkward, tender friction of 2 adults sharing a space too small for their growing, unspoken bond. The next morning, Stephen insisted on walking to the workshop. He made it 3 steps before his knees buckled. Maddie was there instantly. She caught him under the arm, her grip like iron, wrapped in velvet. "Easy, soldier," she murmured. "Your equilibrium is shot. The feedback from the harness scrambled your inner ear." "I need to work," Stephen grumbled, leaning heavily against her. She smelled of wood smoke and rain. It was a distracting, pleasant smell. "I have a chair order for the miller." "The miller can sit on the floor," Maddie declared, steering him back toward the house. "Or he can stand. It is good for the posture." "You are a tyrant," Stephen muttered. "I am a nursemaid," Maddie corrected. "In my clan, when a warrior is injured after a great battle, they are fed peeled grapes and fanned with large leaves until they recover. Stephen looked at her. I do not have grapes. Iris, who was following them with a look of serious concern, chimed in. We have potato cakes, Papa. They are round like grapes, just flatter, and browner, and tasting of grease. Potato cakes, Maddie mused. A delicacy. We shall use those. They managed to get Stephen to the porch swing. He sat down heavily, his breath coming in short gasps. Maddie sat beside him. The swing groaned under their combined weight, but held. Iris ran off to fetch the potato cakes. It was twilight. The dual suns were setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. The valley was quiet. Thank you, Stephen said, looking at his hands, for catching me. In the cave. And just now. You are welcome, Maddie said softly. She was looking at him, her gaze tracing the line of his jaw, the gray at his temples. You caught me first, remember, in the garden. When I was a muddy rug, Stephen chuckled. A very heavy rug. He turned to look at her. The distance between them on the swing was non-existent. He could feel the heat of her thigh against his. He could see the flecks of gold in her emerald eyes. The air felt charged again, but not with the static of the glass root. It was the static of two lonely people who had survived something terrible together. Stephen, Maddie said, her voice dropping to a hush. Her hand moved on the seat covering his. Maddie, he breathed. She leaned in. He leaned in. The world narrowed down to the space between them. He could see the faint, downy fur on her cheekbones. He could feel her breath. Papa, Maddie. Iris slammed open the screen door, carrying a plate of greasy potato cakes triumphantly. I put extra salt on them, Iris announced. Stephen and Maddie sprang apart like guilty teenagers. The swing rocked violently. Salt, Stephen choked out, looking at the horizon. Excellent. Good for electrolytes. Yes, Maddie agreed, smoothing her tunic, her ears flushed a dark pink. Sodium is vital. Iris climbed onto the swing between them, oblivious to the tension she had shattered. She shoved a potato cake into Stephen's hand and another into Maddie's. Is Maddie sleeping here tomorrow? Iris asked, taking a huge bite of her own cake. Stephen looked at Maddie over Iris's head. The moment was gone, but the warmth remained. I think, Stephen said slowly, I think Maddie is sleeping here as long as she wants. Maddie smiled. It was a genuine, unguarded smile that made her look less like an alien warrior and more like someone who had finally found a place to rest her pack. I would like that, she said, but the night brings clarity that the day obscures. Hours later, the house was silent. Stephen was asleep, his breathing heavy and rhythmic. Iris was curled in her alcove. Maddie sat on the porch steps, staring up at the bioluminescent canopy of the high forest miles above. The potato cakes were gone. The warmth of the swing was a memory. In her hand, she held a small object. It was a feather, a long flight feather from a Cathari wind dancer. It was charred black at the edges. She had found it in the pocket of Stephen's coat when she was cleaning it. It wasn't just a souvenir. It was evidence. She closed her eyes, letting the memory of the Council of Elders wash over her. 3 weeks ago. The tremors are the work of a root burner, the High Elder had said, his voice like grinding stones. The prophecy says one remains. He hides in the deep valley. Go, Maddie, find him. If he still possesses the black iron voice, destroy him. We cannot survive another burning. She had come here to kill him. She had come here to find the monster that had scorched her brother's wings and turned the West Ridge to ash. And she had found him. He was Stephen. But he was also the man who tucked the blanket in on the empty side of the bed. He was the man who made toys for his daughter. He was the man who had nearly killed himself trying to sing the earth to sleep instead of breaking it. Maddie looked at the charred feather. If she told the High Elder the truth that the root burner was alive and armed, the Cathari warpack would descend on this valley by the next moon. They would slaughter Stephen. They would burn this house. But if she didn't tell them, she looked back through the window, at the sleeping form of the man. Farron was right about one thing. The glass root was still unstable. Stephen had bought them time, but he hadn't cured the disease. And Hearthdeep looked at the ground. She could feel it now. The pulse. Hearthdeep wasn't just near the glass root. It was built directly on top of the central node, the heart. If Stephen used the destructive frequency here, if Farron forced him, or if he panicked, the shockwave wouldn't just break the valley. It would travel up the main trunk. It would shatter the foundation of the high forest. It would be an extinction event for her people. She was trapping herself in a lie. She was protecting the man who held the gun to her species' head. A rustle in the bushes made her ears swivel. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a Cathari scout, young Swift clad in leather armor. He didn't step onto the porch. He stayed in the darkness. "Sister," the scout hissed. Maddie didn't move. "Roland." "The elders grow impatient," Roland whispered. "Have you found the source of the disturbance? Have you found the burner?" Maddie's grip on the charred feather tightened until the quill snapped. "I am investigating," Maddie said, her voice steady, betraying nothing. "The interference is complex. I need more time." "The trees at the southern edge are turning to glass," Roland said urgently. "The sickness is climbing. If you do not find the cause soon, the elders will send the fire callers. They will purge the valley themselves." Maddie's blood ran cold. The fire callers were the Cathari equivalent of root burners. They didn't use sound. They used plasma. "Tell them to wait," Maddie commanded. "I have a lead. 2 days. Give me 2 days." Roland hesitated, then bowed. 2 days, sister. Then the sky falls." He vanished into the night. Maddie sat alone on the porch. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. 2 days. She couldn't keep this secret anymore. She couldn't play house and eat potato cakes while the fuse was burning down on both sides. She needed to take Stephen to the forest. She needed to show him what the burn looked like from the other side. She needed to tell him who she really was and what she was supposed to do to him. She stood up. She walked back into the house. She stood over Stephen's bed. He looked peaceful. He looked like a good man. "I am going to break his heart," Maddie thought, a tear sliding down her furred cheek. "But I have to, so I do not have to stop his heart." She reached down and gently touched his cheek. He stirred, leaning into her touch in his sleep. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "Tomorrow we go to the roots." The morning of the 4th day dawned gray and overcast. The dual suns were hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds that promised rain, acidic heavy rain from the industrial zones far to the north. Stephen was awake early, testing his legs. They held. The pain was manageable. Maddie was already up. She was packing a rucksack. Dried meat water skins, a coil of rope. "Going somewhere?" Stephen asked, limping into the kitchen. Maddie didn't look up. Her movements were sharp, efficient. "We are going for a hike. You, me, and Iris." "A hike?" Stephen frowned. "I am barely walking, Maddie. And the weather looks bad." "We are taking the hauler," Maddie said. "We are going up the logging road, to the edge of the forest." Stephen paused. The edge of the forest was the boundary line. Humans didn't go there. It was Cathari territory. "Why?" Stephen asked. Maddie turned. Her eyes were dull, the gold flecks dim. She looked tired, burdened by a weight he couldn't see. "Because there is something you need to see," she said. "And there is something I need to tell you. And I cannot do it inside these walls." Stephen looked at her. He saw the seriousness in her stance. This wasn't a request. "Is it about the glass root?" he asked. "It is about everything," Maddie said. "Get Iris. We leave in 10 minutes." The drive up the canyon wall was silent. The electric hauler whined as it climbed the steep switchbacks. Iris sat in the back, sensing the mood, clutching her rabbit, and watching the stone walls pass by. As they climbed, the vegetation changed. The scrub brush of the valley gave way to the towering, bioluminescent fungi and massive fern trees of the high forest. The air grew cooler, richer with oxygen. They reached the plateau. Maddie stopped the hauler. "We walk from here. It is just past the ridge." Stephen grabbed his walking stick. He took Iris's hand. They followed Maddie through the undergrowth. The forest was beautiful, but it was a scarred beauty. Stephen noticed old wounds on the trees, burn marks that had healed over craters in the ground that were now ponds. Maddie led them to a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of ancient, standing stones. They were covered in moss, but the centers were scorched black. And beneath their feet, the glass root was visible. It wasn't buried here. It broke the surface, forming a natural floor of swirling, cloudy crystal. But something was wrong. Stephen stepped onto the crystal floor. He looked at the trees surrounding the clearing. They were encased in glass. 20 massive ancient trees. Their bark was gone, replaced by a translucent, shimmering layer of silica. Inside the glass, the wood was gray, withered. The leaves were frozen in mid-fall, turned to brittle emerald shards. It was the same as the orchard, but on a massive scale. "This is the wound," Maddie said, her voice hollow. She walked to the center of the circle and turned to face him. "This is where it happened," she said. 10 years ago. The Great Burning." Stephen froze. He knew the coordinates. He had seen them on a targeting screen. Sector 7G. "I didn't know it was this close," Stephen whispered. "It was the epicenter," Maddie said. She reached into her tunic and pulled out the charred feather. She held it out to him. "This belonged to my brother," Maddie said. "He was standing right where you are standing now. When the sonic wave hit the ground, turned to liquid. He didn't drown. He was crystallized. He is still down there, Stephen. Part of the floor." Iris gasped, hiding behind Stephen's leg. Stephen felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at the glass floor beneath his boots. He was standing on a graveyard he had built. "Maddie." "I was sent here to find you," Maddie said. Tears were streaming down her face, now wetting her fur. "The elders told me the root burner was still alive. They told me to find him, to test him, and if he was still a danger, to lead him into a resonance trap and kill him." She dropped the feather. It drifted down, landing on the glass with a tiny tink sound. "I found him," Maddie said, her voice breaking. "He is a carpenter. He makes toys. He saved my life." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand the impossible position she was in. "But the elders are coming, Stephen. They know the glass is spreading, and Farron is right. The only way to stop the spread is to reset the frequency. But if you do it Farron's way, you kill my people. And if you do nothing, the glass takes us all." Stephen looked at the woman he was falling in love with. He looked at the daughter he was trying to protect. And he looked at the destruction he had caused. The falling action was over. The ground had run out beneath them. "I am the root burner," Stephen said into the silence of the glass forest. "And I am done running." He dropped his walking stick. "So," Stephen asked, his voice steady. "What do we do?" Maddie wiped her eyes. She took a deep breath. "We do not burn it," she said. "And we do not ignore it." She stepped closer. "We change it." The wind picked up, howling through the glass trees, sounding like 1,000 flutes, playing a funeral dirge. But in that dirge, Stephen heard a new note, a note of possibility. He took Iris's hand. He took Maddie's hand. "Show me," Stephen said. The glass forest was silent, save for the wind that moaned through the frozen, crystalline branches. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of ozone and ancient grief. Stephen stood in the center of the circle of memory, his boots resting on the translucent floor, where the glass roots swirled like a captive storm. He was still holding Maddie's hand, but his grip had slackened, not from lack of affection, but from the sheer crushing weight of the revelation. He wasn't just a soldier. He was the architect of this graveyard. "The root burner," Stephen whispered. The name tasted like ash. "That is what your people call me," Maddie nodded. She had released his hand and stepped back, creating a physical distance that mirrored the chasm opening between their histories. Her emerald eyes were wet, the pupils blown wide with a mixture of sorrow and a fierce, terrifying resolve. 10 years ago, Maddie began, her voice steady, but low, vibrating with that Cathari harmonic that made the very air seem to listen. The deep wars were ending, but the humans wanted to ensure the tunnels could never be used again. You launched a sonic payload, Sector 7G. I was told it was an empty supply line, Stephen said. He wasn't making an excuse. He was stating the lie he had been fed. I was told it was structurally compromised already. It was the main aquifer for the western route, Maddie corrected him. When you hit the resonance frequency, the water flash-boiled. The pressure blew the glass route outward. It didn't just shatter the tunnels. It surged up the taproots. It turned the sap in the trees to glass. It turned the blood in our veins to crystal. She gestured to the frozen, glittering trees around them. My brother was a scout. He was standing right there. He didn't die from the blast. He died because his own body turned into a statue in 3 seconds. He suffocated inside his own skin. Iris, who had been hiding behind Stephen's leg, let out a small, terrified whimper. She looked up at her father, the man who made her wooden horses, and checked under the bed for monsters. Stephen felt his knees give way. He sank down onto the glass floor, the cold seeping instantly through his trousers. He put his head in his hands. I didn't know, he choked out. I swear to you, Maddie, I didn't know. Ignorance does not unburn the forest, Stephen, Maddie said softly. She reached into her tunic again. This time, she didn't pull out a feather. She pulled out a small, intricate device made of bone and wire. It hummed faintly. My mission, Maddie said, her voice trembling, was not just a scout. The elders gave me this. It is a beacon. If I activate it, it sends a signal to the fire callers. They will target this location. They will scour the valley with plasma until nothing remains but bedrock. Stephen looked up at the device. It was a death sentence for Hearthdeep, for Iris. Why haven't you used it? He asked. Because, Maddie said, her hand shaking. Because I was supposed to lure the monster here and trap him. I was supposed to confirm he was a soulless weapon. But instead, she looked at Iris, then at Stephen. Instead, I found a man who saved a dying fox. I found a man who would rather let a cave collapse on him than hurt the earth again. I found a father. She closed her hand over the beacon. I cannot kill you, Stephen, and I cannot let my people kill you. But I cannot let the glass root consume us either. We are at a deadlock, and the ground is shaking. Indeed, the glass floor beneath them vibrated. A low, rhythmic thumping, thump, 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 echoed from deep below. The glass root was listening. It was waiting for the next command: destroy, or be destroyed. Stephen looked at his hands. The hands that had built a cradle. The hands that had destroyed a forest. There has to be another way, Stephen said. He stood up, wincing as his injured ribs protested. We have been treating the glass root like an enemy. Farron wants to kill it. The Cathari want to prune it. I tried to burn it. It is a parasite, Maddie said. It consumes. No, Stephen said. He looked at the frozen trees. It conducts. It moves energy. It only consumes when the circuit is broken. When it's starving, he turned to Maddie. The frequency I used in the cave, the one you helped me find. It didn't destroy the glass. It made it soft. It made it weave. It was a stabilization song, Maddie said. But we cannot sing it forever. We don't have the lung capacity, and the harness is broken. We don't need the harness, Stephen said. A frantic, desperate idea was forming in his mind. The harness just amplified the signal. But the signal was wrong. It was binary, on or off, loud or quiet. He looked at Iris. Iris, come here. The little girl stepped forward, her eyes wide. Are you in trouble, Papa? No, Bug, Stephen said gently. But we need your help. Remember the song you were humming yesterday when you were playing with the little fox? Iris nodded. The buzzing song. Do it again. Iris took a deep breath and let out a small, high-pitched hum. It was a simple sound, pure and unwavering. Stephen looked at Maddie. Do the Cathari howl. The low one. The morning song. Maddie hesitated, then threw her head back. Her throat vibrated. A deep, resonant growl emerged, weaving under Iris's high note. Stephen closed his eyes. He listened. He found the gap between the two sounds, the middle ground. The human range. He added his own voice, a baritone hum that bridged the high and the low. The three sounds met in the air. They didn't just mix. They locked.
Vo-hum-row!
The glass floor beneath them didn't shatter. It didn't liquefy. It lit up. A soft, pulsing blue light spread from their feet, racing outward through the frozen roots. It wasn't the violent violet of the infection. It was the calm, steady azure of a healthy circulatory system. It's a triad, Stephen whispered, opening his eyes. The glass root doesn't need to be burned. It needs to be tuned. It's a biological network. It's been screaming in pain because we've been shouting at it with monofrequencies. It needs a chord. Maddie stared at the floor. The blue light was traveling up the trunk of the nearest glass tree. Inside the transparent bark, something miraculous happened. A tiny green shoot pushed through the dead gray wood. Life, Maddie breathed. It is not consuming the energy. It is sharing it. We can fix it, Stephen said. He looked at Maddie with a fierce intensity. Not just the valley, the forest too. We can retune the entire network, but we have to do it at the node, right here. Maddie looked at the beacon in her hand. She looked at the green shoot. She reared back and threw the bone device as hard as she could into the dense undergrowth. Then we sing, Maddie said. We sing until our throats bleed. The ritual was not magic. It was physics, biology, and sheer endurance. They stood in the center of the clearing for 3 hours. Stephen wore the remnants of the resonance chest piece, not to amplify, but to monitor the frequency. Maddie shifted into her Cathari form, the massive golden fox, to generate the sheer volume of bass needed to penetrate the bedrock. Iris stood between them, holding Stephen's hand and clutching Maddie's fur. They created a living circuit. Maddie provided the power, the deep, earth-shaking rumble that loosened the rigid glass structures deep underground. Stephen provided the control, the modulating middle tone that guided the energy, shaping it into lattices and support beams. And Iris provided the heart. Her high, pure frequency acted as the binding agent, the spark of life that told the semi-sentient crystal. We are not enemies. We are symbiotic. It was exhausting. Stephen's voice cracked. His legs shook. He felt the old metal plates in his head heating up. Hold it, Stephen gasped, checking the dial on his chest. The feedback is stabilizing. We are at 90% harmonic efficiency. Maddie let out a roar that shook leaves from the trees a mile away. Her golden fur stood on end, sparking with static. Iris was crying, tired and scared, but she didn't stop humming. She knew, with the instinct of a child, that this was the most important game she would ever play. And then it happened. The ground gave a massive heave, not a shake, but a sigh. The violet light that had plagued the edges of the forest for months flickered and vanished. In its place, a wave of soft, pulsating blue light washed over the entire plateau. It raced down the canyon walls, traveled under the fields of Hearth Deep, and settled deep into the planet's core. The angry, itching sound behind Stephen's eyes stopped. Silence returned. But it wasn't the silence of the grave. It was the silence of a fever breaking. Stephen collapsed. Maddie shifted back to human form, catching him before he hit the ground. They sprawled on the glass floor, a tangle of limbs and exhaustion. Iris curled up on top of them, asleep instantly. Did we do it? Stephen wheezed. Maddie looked around. The glass trees were still glass damage that old couldn't be undone in a day. But the light inside them was warm. And all around the clearing, new saplings were pushing up through the soil, vibrant and green. "We didn't just fix it," Matty whispered, stroking his hair. "We evolved it." The weeks that followed were a time of uneasy transition for Hearthdeep. The immediate threat of the collapse was gone. The water cistern was stable, supported now by a beautiful, intricate web of blue glass that the villagers came to marvel at. The fields, instead of turning to dust, began to yield crops that were larger and sweeter than before, fed by the nutrient-rich energy, pulsing gently from the tamed glass root below. But the social healing was slower than the geological one. Farron remained suspicious. He watched Stephen from a distance, muttering about alien magic and playing God. But he could not deny the harvest. And he could not deny that his own house had stopped shaking. The Cathari elders came down from the forest. That was a day of tension. They stood at the edge of the village, tall, imposing figures in ceremonial armor. Stephen walked out to meet them unarmed with Matty by his side. He expected a trial. He expected execution. Instead, the high elder, a Cathari with fur as white as snow, walked up to Stephen. He sniffed the air around Stephen's chest. He looked at the blue light pulsing in the ground. "The burner is dead," the elder announced, his voice carrying to the watching villagers. "This is the Weaver." It wasn't forgiveness. The Cathari had long memories. But it was a truce. They assigned 2 young Cathari listeners to stay in the village to learn the technique of the triad song from Stephen and Iris, ensuring the network would never go septic again. Stephen became a teacher. Not of war, but of resonance. He taught the children, both human and Cathari, how to listen to the earth. One evening, 3 months after the ritual, the house was quiet. The autumn chill had set in. The fire in the hearth was roaring, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Stephen sat in his armchair, a book open on his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was watching the scene on the rug. Iris was lying on her stomach, drawing a picture of a tree with blue roots. Beside her, Matty was curled up in her half-shifted form, mostly human, but with the ears and the tail fully out for comfort. She was grooming her tail with a silver brush Stephen had carved for her. "Hold still," Matty muttered to her own tail. "You are being difficult today." "It is fluffy," Iris observed without looking up. "It is high maintenance," Matty corrected. Stephen smiled. The knot of guilt that had lived in his chest for 10 years was still there, but it was smaller now. It was a scar, not a wound. He knew he could never fully atone for the burning of the forest, but he could spend the rest of his life tending the garden that grew from the ashes. "Matty," Stephen said. She looked up, her emerald eyes catching the firelight. "Yes." "I was thinking about the bedroom door," Stephen said. "The frame is still too low. You hit your ear yesterday." "I have learned to duck," Matty said. "You shouldn't have to duck in your own home," Stephen said quietly. The brush stopped moving. Matty went very still. Iris stopped drawing. "My own home," Matty repeated, testing the words. "Unless you plan on going back to the canopy," Stephen said. "But I hear the rent up there is terrible. And the potato cakes are non-existent." Matty looked at him. The playfulness faded, replaced by a deep, vulnerable warmth. "The company down here is significantly better." "Then I will widen the door tomorrow," Stephen said, "and maybe build a bigger bed. This one is getting crowded." "We fit," Iris protested. "I like the squish." "The squish is acceptable for winter," Matty conceded. "But in summer a Cathari generates significant thermal output. You will roast." "I'll take the risk," Stephen said. Matty stood up. She walked over to him, her movements fluid and graceful. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. It wasn't a tentative kiss, like the ones they had shared in the shadows over the last few weeks. It was a claim. "Then fix the door, Weaver," she whispered. She turned to Iris. "All right, little bug. Time for sleep. The moons are high." "Can we do the song first?" Iris asked. "Just a short one," Stephen said. "To say goodnight to the roots." They stood together in the center of the room. Stephen, the scarred soldier. Maddie, the alien exile. Iris, the bridge between worlds. They hummed. A soft, low triad. The floorboards vibrated gently in response, a purring acknowledgement from the planet below. Later, in the dark. The expanded family was in the bed. Iris was in the middle, fast asleep, snoring softly. Maddie lay on the left. She was awake, staring at the ceiling. She shifted her tail, draping over Stephen's legs. "Stephen," she whispered. "Do you remember the first night?" she asked. "When I fell in your yard?" "Hard to forget," Stephen murmured. "You crushed my rosemary." "I was terrified," Maddie confessed. "Not of the wound, but of asking. I was a giant monster in a stranger's house. I thought you would make me sleep in the shed." Stephen turned on his side, reaching over Iris to find Maddie's hand in the dark. He interlaced his fingers with hers. "I asked where I should sleep," Maddie continued. "And you looked so sad. You looked at this empty space like it was a grave." "It was," Stephen said. "But it isn't anymore." Maddie squeezed his hand. "So, just to be clear for the record, where does the giant alien fox sleep?" Stephen smiled in the darkness. He felt the warmth of her hand, the weight of her tail, the steady breathing of his daughter. He felt the hum of the earth, no longer a scream, but a lullaby. He pulled the quilt up, tucking it around Maddie's shoulder, then smoothing the corner, just like he used to, but this time there was someone under it. "Right here," Stephen said. "And here," Iris mumbled in her sleep, kicking out a leg. "And there," Stephen laughed softly. He closed his eyes. Outside, the glass root glowed with a steady, enduring light, holding the valley in its crystalline embrace. The war was over. The house was full. And for the first time in 10 years, Stephen Vance slept without dreaming of fire. The end.